Welcome to the Kottke Ride Home for Tuesday, November 9th, 2021. I'm Jackson Bird. Today, a deep dive down the drain pipe to discuss why America has so few public restrooms, plus how Pinterest ruined Google search and a few options for fixing it. Here are some of the cool things from the news today. Public restrooms, places often of discomfort, disgust, distrust, and, at least in America, disappearance. The U.S. has never had a great track record with public restrooms, but over the last several decades, they've decreased more and more in number. And during the pandemic, the problem became even worse as businesses tightened their customers-only policies and cities shut down public facilities for fear of spreading COVID-19. Living in New York City, there's a joke that Starbucks is our public restroom. I mean, technically speaking, there are over 1,000 public restrooms in New York City and just about 300 Starbuckses, but while the city-run public restrooms are often locked, out of order, or otherwise inaccessible, the Starbucks ones tend to be easy to come by, and at least cleaned a couple of times a day. While New York City, like other urban areas, is one of the places in the nation with the greatest need for public restrooms, it's not much better in the rest of the country. A public toilet index published in August from a UK bathroom supply company noted that the US has just 8 toilets per 100,000 people. Compare that to the 56 toilets per 100,000 people in Iceland, or 46 in Switzerland and 45 in New Zealand. Just 8 for the US. We're tied with Botswana, although notably we're also tied with the Netherlands, and I'd be curious to look more into that later. But the point remains for now that the US is far behind other nations when it comes to government-funded restrooms, and a recent Bloomberg article dug into exactly why that is. And when I think about the lack of public restrooms here, I'm often reminded of my experiences traveling throughout Europe, where there are many more restrooms on offer, but you have to pay for them. It's usually only about 10 cents, and in some cases you can even get your coin back afterwards, like a shopping cart. It feels a little like the musical Urinetown, but I've always figured, hey, if that's what it takes to build more public restrooms that are actually open and accessible to people, I could start carrying around more loose change. And it turns out these coin-operated types of restrooms did used to exist in the U.S., back in the 50s through the 70s. By 1970, Bloomberg notes there were over 50,000 coin-operated restrooms in the United States. But activists at the time organized around an excellent point. Coin-operated restrooms are not actually accessible to everyone. Not everyone has 10 cents to spare anytime they need to use the facilities. By 1980, this thought had successfully won out, and the coin-operated restrooms across the nation largely shut down. The only problem? Free ones did not open in their place, as the organizers had intended. So we had even fewer restrooms than before, and the ones we had were getting a bad reputation for being places of drug use and sexual encounters. Bloomberg notes that by the early 80s, out of concerns for safety, almost all of the 472 restrooms inside of New York City's subway stations had been locked, and I can tell you firsthand that most of them are still locked to this day. The final nail in the coffin for public restrooms in the U.S., though? 9/11. 20 years out, we've seen numerous effects of the fanatic security protocols that were implemented following the terrorist attacks, and the closure of many public restrooms due to safety and security is just another one of them. But coin-operated public restrooms in the 1950s is hardly the beginning of the story, and 9/11 isn't quite the end. Public restrooms first started being trialed in the U.S. in the second half of the 19th century, as we learned more about the connection between the spread of disease through water and waste systems. Inspired by similar existing facilities in Paris, New York City built their first public restroom, just the one, in 1869. It had 2 stalls and a wash basin for women, and then another compartment for men featuring 3 urinals, 2 seats, and no doors, because men, of course, don't need privacy. Despite the lack of privacy, men used the public restroom in large numbers, 1,000 of them a day. Meanwhile, just 25 women per day used it. And there are a number of possible reasons for this. One, middle and upper class women didn't go out and about nearly as much as their male counterparts in the highly gendered segregated time. And 2, those higher class women wore tons of complicated layers of clothing. Their skirts literally might not have fit in the stalls, and some required assistance getting dressed and undressed. Though, of course, many women's wardrobes at the time time did have different means for easily relieving oneself without getting completely undressed, but there's also the fact that the cast iron restroom would have been burning hot in the summer and icy cold in the winter. Not exactly pleasant, and especially not for a population less accustomed to doing their business in public, shielded as they may have been by the stalls. In part because half of its compartment was a relative failure, the public restroom was shut down a few years later, and when other cities tried similar, simpler public restrooms, they opted to only install urinals. And then, around the turn of the century, throughout the Progressive Era, the call for government-funded hygiene measures got a bit roped into the temperance movement, which was good for both at first. Part of the thinking was that if there were public restrooms, men wouldn't have to go into taverns to use the toilet where they might be tempted to buy a drink. There was also a new push for water fountains, which would relieve men of the need to go buy a beer to quench his thirst. And when Prohibition actually happened, there was an immediate need to build public restrooms since their go-to option, all the taverns, had to shut down. I'd like to say that if all the Starbuckses in New York City shut down or refused to let people use their restrooms, the city would be forced to invest in more public restrooms. But I remember a few Starbuckses in the city tried this several years ago, and all it resulted in was corporate chastising them and then issuing a public apology. But anyways, organizers in the Progressive Era also sold people on the public restroom idea by acting like they cared about the lower class. Quoting Bloomberg, "These were public health measures rooted in the idea that people of the lower classes, immigrants in particular, were prone to spreading infectious disease that could reach those of higher status. It was also a moral crusade. Many reformers insisted that public amenities helped members of the lower classes avoid drunkenness, violence, and promiscuity." End quote. Yeah, the results are good, but the reasoning is a little offensively twisted. But it did work. There was an explosion of public restroom facilities in the first 2 decades of the 20th century in the US. But in the post-war heyday of the 1920s, as places like department stores, theaters, and hotels proliferated both in number and in high-class clientele, they became the favored place for middle and upper classes to relieve themselves. Being privately owned, they could trip out their restrooms with all of the modern home comforts. Why go to a practical, bare-bones public restroom when you could visit one at a department store with a cushy chaise lounge chair? But of course, yet again, this kept the lower classes out. Some department stores tried to fix this by offering less lavish restrooms and shopping experiences in the basement so that the two classes could shop without encountering each other. Peter Baldwin, a professor of history at the University of Connecticut who has studied the emergence of public restrooms in the U.S., describes this as a real turning point in the U.S., quoting the New York Times, "This line of thinking, a contributing factor to the decline of public restrooms, involved a shift from believing that the government should be responsible for providing bodily privacy toward what Baldwin calls a consumer model of privacy. If the individual wants to purchase privacy, you go right ahead," he says. "You go to that restaurant and you buy your coffee so you can use the bathroom. But providing bodily privacy is not the responsibility of the taxpayers, and that seemed to be America's choice." End quote. And as we got into the Jim Crow era, the difference in number of restrooms per capita became even more stark between the North and the South. Because in the South, you couldn't just build one restroom for men and one for women. Thanks to mandated racial segregation, you had to build 4. It was twice as expensive, so of course, less places actually did it. And in the 30s, we did get a lot more public restrooms in state and national parks, as well as at highway rest stops. As the Works Progress Administration built up those parks in the federal interstate system, the WPA also built over 2 million bathrooms in rural areas, which became known as Roosevelt Rooms. But then came the post-World War II era and the white flight to the suburbs. Downtown shopping districts, where most of the public restrooms were, declined, and that eventually led into those coin-operated restrooms, which then got closed in what should have been a good move, but ended up being even worse. And that's kind of the story of restrooms. Quoting again, "The presence or absence of restrooms in public spaces has long been an indication of a particular group's place in society," says Laura Noren, a postdoctoral associate at New York University and co-editor of Toilet, The Public Restroom and the Politics of Sharing. From women to people of color to those with disabilities, vulnerable communities have struggled to have this most fundamental of needs accommodated. Most recently, transgender individuals have found themselves targeted in bathroom backlash debates. It's basically the same script that just plays over and over and over again, and these social tensions often meet in the bathroom, Noren says. Who gets access to the bathroom really could be summarized as who should have access to public space and public discourse. Somehow, that crystallizes around the bathroom, because people's fears are at the highest in the bathroom. End quote. Or as Baldwin put it, quote, "If you don't have public bathrooms, what you're saying is, we do not care about anyone who doesn't have money," which I think encapsulates where American politics has been going since 1980. I hope there will be a move toward greater acceptance of public spending and government intervention, because that's what it's going to take to deal with the problem. End quote. And there have been a number of cities across the U.S. investing in trials of various sanitary, accessible, tamper-proof public restrooms, with the Portland Loo being among the most notable. And it can be easy to feel like nothing will ever change when it comes to huge stalemate opinions on things like government intervention. But looking back at the history of so many things, like public restrooms, shows how major events heralded major changes. And this pandemic has been nothing short of a major event. So maybe there is hope for some improved public restroom facilities in the U.S. I mean, I haven't read the entire 2,700-page-long infrastructure bill just yet. I don't think anything in there explicitly mentions public restrooms, but maybe it could be a start. I'm sure you've had this experience before. You're trying to find an image of something, you do a Google image search, you see a good representation of what you were looking for, you click on it, and you get led to a Pinterest login page. You might go back to the results and find another image, not quite as perfect as your top choice, but still pretty good. Click Pinterest login. And again, I have several times been unable to find the kind of image I'm looking for in any results that aren't from Pinterest. And the thing is, I have a Pinterest account, I just haven't logged into it in forever. I don't remember the password. I'm not going to try to log in if I'm on my phone quickly searching for an image. And often, even if you do go through all that trouble, the image isn't even as high quality as it seemed in the preview. Pinterest's takeover of Google search results isn't just annoying, it's representative of a larger shift in how we use the internet and who controls it. Alistair Scott, who works in communications in London, told Input Mag that the way he searches and browses has changed dramatically in the past 10 or even just 5 years, which I'd agree with. I'm either fighting against personalized algorithms, or I've changed my behavior to allow them to fill in the gaps of what I mean, making my job easier, if also creepier, but markedly different than the more intelligent and intentional searching I was taught to do. Quoting Input, Scott laments the end of the gold rush era of the internet. We all got too used to being able to dip in and get pics through Google without really caring who was ultimately hosting them, he says. This is all a big loss for ordinary web surfers, but a boon for Pinterest. The sorts of disruption that you're hinting at here, how one emerging service disrupts another established service, is core to a lot of the tech development and how tech giants get market share, explains William Kilbride, executive director of the Digital Preservation Coalition, which works to ensure companies are acting properly to preserve digital data. But it also makes for immense instability as far as users are concerned. For Kilbride, Pinterest's manipulation of Google search results has a negative impact directly on his and his organization's work. The digital preservation community is now quite good at preserving the contents of a file and data more broadly, he says, but we're nowhere close to understanding how to track the continuous development of algorithms that users rely on to search and recover content. Moreover, the tech firms are not likely ever to share that with anyone, as it's their secret sauce. End quote. And Ben Fino-Radin of Small Data Industries, an archiving company, adds that these walled gardens make it much harder for internet archives to actually archive as close to the whole internet as possible. Input spoke to Pinterest, who basically passed the buck, saying it's Google's problem, and that if people are really annoyed, they should just make accounts and sign in for the, quote, best personalized recommendations experience, end quote. Great. Not that I'm super jazzed by the idea of giant companies buying each other, but since the rumor about PayPal acquiring Pinterest last month didn't pan out, Fino-Radin suggested to Input that maybe Google should just buy Pinterest instead, and perhaps that would make the image search experience more seamless. But for now, if you're annoyed by this phenomenon, there are a few things that you can do. First is to try searching with -Pinterest at the end of your search query. Second, there's an extension called Unpinterested, which removes Pinterest from Google search results. And you could, of course, use another search engine. This isn't a faultless strategy, but privacy-focused DuckDuckGo doesn't seem to experience the Pinterest problem nearly as much as Google, so it's definitely worth a shot. Protect your privacy and no longer be trapped in the Pinterest labyrinth. Win-win. Now, one place that you could try going to the restroom, but you might never find your way out again, is IKEA. And if you want to experience the swirling exhaustion of navigating around an IKEA without leaving your home, you can play an online text adventure called the Saturday Afternoon IKEA Trip Simulator. Created by IKEA hater David Guy, it's pretty fun even if you genuinely like IKEA because it walks you through every part of the store with hilariously accurate descriptions of different trademark IKEA items like Billy bookcases and their oddly sized beds. It really gets at the existential trap that many people fall into when they enter that store. Link in the show notes to try it for yourself. But that is it from me for today. As always, this show was produced by Ride Home Media and Kottke.org. I am Jackson Bird, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.